After hours of frantically searching the moor, Mrs. Duru returned home, her heart weighed down by guilt and fear. She found Mr. Duru waiting for her, his demeanor cold and distant. He refused to speak or even look at her. The anger and hurt in his eyes were palpable, and Mrs. Duru could feel it pressing against her like a physical force. She fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she begged him for forgiveness, her voice trembling with desperation. "How could you do this?" Mr. Duru asked, his voice breaking with pain. "What did Nora ever do to you?" Mrs. Duru, unable to stop crying, could barely form coherent thoughts. She felt the weight of her actions crushing her. "I abandoned my own daughter in the moor," she sobbed, her heart aching with the realization of her terrible mistake. As night fell, Mrs. Duru found herself unable to sleep. Her mind replayed the joyful moments from earlier that day, when Nora's face had lit up with excitement in the moor. She remembered how happy Nora had been to pick out dolls, and the guilt of her actions consumed her. "I should have just bought the dolls for you," she wept bitterly, wishing she could turn back time. That night felt endless, the longest she had ever experienced. Her heart was heavy with thoughts of the dangerous situations Nora could have faced alone, all because of her own insecurities and cruelty. "Nora, please come back to me," Mrs. Duru cried into the night, her voice hoarse from calling her daughter's name repeatedly. Tears flowed freely, and sleep eluded her as she wrestled with the torment of her guilt. When morning arrived, Mrs. Duru was still awake, her eyes swollen from crying. A persistent knocking on her bedroom door broke through her fog of despair. Ignoring it at first, she grew increasingly irritated by the interruption. Finally, driven by a mix of anger and exhaustion, she stormed to the door, shouting for whoever it was to go away. To her astonishment, when she opened the door, Nora was standing there. "Am I dreaming?" Mrs. Duru asked herself, her tears flowing anew. Her husband, who had been approaching them, assured her that it was not a dream. "Where did you find her?" Mrs. Duru asked, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and apprehension. Mr. Duru explained that on the day Mrs. Duru abandoned Nora at the moor, their family friend, whom Mrs. Duru had encountered earlier, had seen Nora alone and crying. The friend had called Mr. Duru's number after her repeated attempts to reach Mrs. Duru had failed. The friend had informed Mr. Duru that Nora was at the moor, and he quickly went there. The chief security officer of the moor had taken Nora in and kept her safe until Mr. Duru arrived. Upon finding Nora, Mr. Duru had immediately taken her to his sister's house, asking her to keep Nora safe until he could find Mrs. Duru. He hadn't realized Nora was his daughter until the situation unfolded. Overwhelmed with emotion, Mrs. Duru fell to her knees and pleaded with Nora for forgiveness. "I never knew you were my daughter," she cried out, her voice breaking. "I promise never to treat anyone this way again. I've learned my lesson." Nora, who had always been kind and loving, forgave her mother. Despite the pain and trauma she had endured, Nora's forgiveness was sincere and heartfelt. She was touched by her mother's remorse and efforts to make amends. Mrs. Duru also apologized to Mr. Duru for her lack of trust and for allowing her insecurities to disrupt their lives. Mr. Duru forgave her, reassuring her that his love for her remained unwavering despite everything that had happened. In an unexpected twist, Nia, the woman who had cared for Nora for most of her life, visited them to apologize. She revealed that she had been deeply affected by her own circumstances. She had fallen in love with a man who was HIV positive. He had infected her with the virus and left her to raise their child alone. Her mistreatment of Nora had stemmed from the anger and resentment she felt towards him. Nia had not known that Nora was not her biological child. She apologized to Nora for the hardships she had caused, expressing that this experience had taught her a valuable lesson about compassion and forgiveness. Nora forgave her without hesitation, and they parted ways, never to see each other again. Reunited with their daughter, the Duru family was overjoyed. The emotional scars of the past began to heal as they embraced their newfound family unity. Mrs. Duru, now acutely aware of the pain she had inflicted, committed herself to repairing the trust she had shattered. She devoted herself to making up for lost time, showering Nora with love, attention, and affection. She took Nora to places she had never been, bought her gifts, and, most importantly, offered the motherly love she had always longed for. Although Nora was initially wary, her resilient and forgiving nature allowed her to slowly open up to her mother's newfound warmth. The nightmares of abandonment gradually faded as she adjusted to her new life, filled with love and care. As weeks turned into months, the Duru family grew inseparable. They enrolled Nora in a good school, where she thrived academically and made new friends. Their home, once cold and filled with mistrust, became a place of warmth and laughter. The story's lesson is clear: never act out of impulse or harbor hatred towards others. Approach everyone with love, kindness, and compassion. Treat people the way you would like to be treated and respond to negativity with blessings. We should never punish an innocent child for the mistakes of their parents, as no child chooses their circumstances. This story is a reminder of the power of forgiveness and the importance of compassion in our lives. I hope you enjoyed the story.